War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, Aftermath. The hill was not steep. It was a long, gradual slope. The spring mud made it difficult to climb, as his boots often stuck in the dark, wet ground. He glanced around at the landscape. He remembered everything. He had taken a mental note of it all 3 years ago when he left the Somme Valley. Only a few more steps and he would crest the ridge and see the precious valley again. The lush green fields, the rolling hills in the distance, and the River Somme winding through the valley below. He missed the trees the most. He looked behind him, half expecting to see his family following him, forgetting for a moment that his wife and young daughters were back in Paris. He had made this trek alone, a far cry from the caravan he once led out of St. Véron, the small town that lay on the eastern shores of the River Somme. Claude Duval thought back to those days, the days when the war was getting ever too close. The people were scared, and as a result, they looked to the mayor, to him, for guidance, for leadership. He had been the mayor of the small riverside town for just over a decade. He had grown up in this sleepy town, the son of a shoemaker. He had no formal education, so being asked to become the town's mayor, their leader, had come as a surprise to him. As he approached the ridge and the downslope that would take him into the valley, a tear touched the corner of his eye. He decided to sit for a moment, taking it all in. Nothing seemed to have changed. The fields were still green. The trees were beginning to blossom, and the river itself ran its normal course. In the distance, he could see the town, his town, St. Véron. Accented by the cathedral that the town had grown around over the last few hundred years, it looked intact. But he would know more as he got closer. He stood and began his descent towards home. The River Somme was calm when he reached it. He walked along the shore to the Véron Bridge, the old stone crossing built during his great-grandfather's time. He was surprised to see it intact. He stopped a moment to gaze across the river and into the town. There were people milling about in the streets. How could this be? The armistice was only 4 months old. There was no way the town could be inhabitable this soon. Not after the fierce fighting that had occurred nearby, not after hearing the news of other towns being reduced to rubble. A woman was kneeling on the other bank of the river. She was dipping clothes into the river for washing. She looked up and saw him. Quickly, she stood and waved. "Mayor Duval, welcome home." It was Margot Lambert, the wife of Yves Lambert, a local man who fished the river and sold his catch at a local market stall. He waved back at her. "Thank you, Miss Lambert." He made his way over the bridge and into the town that he knew so well. His goal had been to survey the damage. When they had fled the town, the war had been close enough to smell the gunpowder and the blood. They could hear the shells whistle in the night, and the blasts shook their floors. Along his path, he was intercepted by more townspeople. There was Marcel the baker, Marie the schoolteacher, and others. Each interaction was brief. He was not interested in conversation right now. He wanted to see his home, the 2-story house that stood near the centuries-old cathedral, the home some distant relative had built with their own hands as the town first emerged from the ground. He politely excused himself from each interaction and made his way down the cobbled main street, the street that would lead him to the home where his 2 daughters had been nursed, the home where he and his wife had shared many quiet mornings, sitting outside, watching the sun rise. Along the way, he noticed no damaged structures, no shell holes in the roads, no burned homes, and no evidence that the town had been used by troops, French, British, or otherwise. It was the same with his family home. No damage, no evidence of burning, nothing at all. As he entered, he noticed the dust. After 3 years, more than an inch had settled across the floors and furniture, dulling everything in sight. There was some damage, but it looked like it was the work of animals that had come inside, either seeking shelter from the weather, or perhaps even from the raging war that must have come close at one point. His was one of the few homes equipped with a telephone system, installed just before the war broke out. He used it to call the hotel in Paris where his wife Madeline was staying with his 2 daughters, Sophie, who was 14, and Yvonne, who was 11. He wanted to tell them that it was safe to come home, that tomorrow they could board a train to Abbeville, the closest station still in operation. He would find a wagon and a pair of horses, if he could, and meet them at the station to bring them the rest of the way. He had just hung up the telephone when there was a knock at the door. He made his way to the door and opened it. Standing on the top step was Luc Bouchard, the local butcher. "Luc, how are you? Please come in." Luc stepped up onto the threshold and into the house. "I heard you were back." "Not surprised. News travels quickly." "When did you return? Where did your family go?" he asked. Luc took a seat in an armchair near the door. "We came back just after the first of the year. We stayed in Abbeville. Helene has an aunt there. Where did you go?" Claude took a seat on the small sofa adjacent to the armchair. "Well, Madeline always wanted to go to Paris." "Paris? While we were scared for our homes, you went sightseeing in Paris?" There was a small hint of tension in the air now. Claude felt it. "I took a clerk job in the Defense Ministry, and Madeline started working at a factory that baked bread for the boys at the front." Luc stood now and walked towards a window. He slowly opened the curtains. Outside, the cathedral rose in all of its majesty. "Not much of a view. Can't see past the cathedral." Luc turned around. He was smiling. "But it's a nice wall," Claude smiled back. The tension disappeared. Claude continued. "I was surprised that St. Verone escaped damage. The fighting seemed so close when they ordered us to evacuate." "Me too." Luc paused. "Do you remember the meeting you had to call to give everyone the order?" He did remember. He had received a notice from the Defense Ministry that very morning. The first days of the battle had seen mass casualties, and with reinforcements arriving daily for both sides, the front was spreading, encroaching on small towns up and down the valley. St. Verone had been very close to being swallowed up by that expansion. "I do remember," Claude finally answered. "The walls shook as you spoke, even though the fighting was 5 miles away. It was almost as if the war itself was accentuating your every word." "Everyone was so scared," Claude added. Luc sat back down. "I hear that Mametz and Le Boisel are no more, completely destroyed." "I heard that as well, but not just them, other places too. It's a tragedy." Luc leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees. "Yet we were spared. Not one shell dropped here. No damage at all, except for animal damage, that is." Claude had already thought of this. He was perplexed by that fact as well. "We're lucky, I guess." Luc leaned back again. "When's your family coming back?" "Tomorrow. I'll walk to Abbeville. Hopefully I can get a wagon to bring them back." "There were a few wagons around town, and horses. Seems the military just let the horses roam free when all was said and done." Luc chuckled at the absurdity. Claude asked, "Have you inspected most of the town, Luc?" "Oh, yes," Luc answered, "but we haven't been to the northeast yet, to the fields. We were a few months from harvest when we left. I'm sure the crops withered in the winter. How did you and the others that returned eat over the winter?" Luke leaned in again. "People left a lot of grains and flour in the homes when we left. Some had weevils, but we salvaged as much as we could." Claude took a moment to think. "Many people went to Paris. I'm sure word will spread fast that it's safe to come home now. Let's call a meeting in a few days. Get some people together to inspect the fields." "When and where?" Luke asked. "Today is Monday. Let's do Friday." He looked out the window. "In the cathedral." "Sounds good. I'll spread the word." Luke stood to leave. "And welcome home, Mayor." As he had expected, Madeline and the girls had spread the word around Paris. More than 200 people had returned to the town in time for the meeting in the cathedral. Homes had been inspected. They were cleaned of any animal evidence and rotten food disposed of. The town was attempting to get back to normal, and it was happening at a breakneck pace that Claude had not expected. This morning, Claude, Luke, and others, including Yves Lambert the fisherman and an artisan named Lucien Martin, prepared for the day ahead. In all, 50 men gathered in the street just outside the Duval home. Yves and Claude had spent the morning filling buckets at the river and loading them onto a cart. It was nearly 3 miles from the center of town to the fields that lay just to the northeast, and the men would need water in the cool March afternoon. Madeline and other women around town had baked bread, and that had been packed as well. It was Luke's idea to pack shovels and pickaxes, as well as sacks of seed, just in case the ground was ready for planting. They loaded rakes, spades, rope, and a few long poles onto the cart as well, along with the water and bread for the day's work. Just beyond St. Véron, the land rose and fell in a series of small hills, uneven ground that the first settlers had never turned into farmland. Instead, they dug narrow ditches there to catch the spring rains and guide the water towards a small reservoir they used for irrigation. The hills continued for nearly 3 miles, and long ago a path had been carved between them, a winding track used for carts and herds making their way to the wide, fertile fields beyond. As they made their way, Claude had asked 10 men to break off to take a quick look at the irrigation ditches and the reservoir. They did as they were asked. After an hour, they could see the path climbing up the final and largest hill. They were almost there. Claude walked with Luke, as well as the artisan Lucien. The horses struggled with the weight of the cart, but eventually they made it. The men lined up along the top of the hill, all looking down at the fields below. Luke was the first to speak, and he did so quietly. "I did not expect this." Before them, instead of the lush green fields they had come to love, they saw devastation. A long, winding trench just at the bottom of the hill, and would look like another in the distance. The earth between them was churned and burned. What looked like shell holes dotted the entire landscape. Quiet conversations began between the men, all wondering what to do next. The land before them was ruined. It would take a lot of work, as well as years, to make it suitable again for planting. It took 3 minutes or more for the conversations to die down, and for the men to start to look at Claude for guidance. He said nothing, just started down the hill. 2 weeks had passed since they first laid eyes on the devastated fields. 2 weeks of clearing debris, trying to fill shell holes, and burying bodies. The work had been slow and required the entire town. Over 500 strong had made their way back to the town over the last few weeks. Homes had been reoccupied, but city business, small shops, and even schools had been put on hold. The town could not be a town again until the fields were adequate. Waiting years to plant crops would just not do. Not for Claude. They had the manpower to make it happen faster. And they would. They had started by taking down the boards that lined the nearest trench system. They watched as the earth that had once been held back slowly slid down to reclaim a portion of the dugout land. They buried the items left behind by the military, canteens, packs, lanterns, and even beds. They were surprised to see bodies scattered around the field outside of the trenches. Some had been trapped on the razor wire that had been placed there to slow the enemy army when it advanced. Claude had chosen a small clearing a half a mile to the west of the fields as the place where they would bury the dead. Almost 100 unnamed soldiers had already been carried there by wagon and interred. Now they were approaching the German lines. These trenches had already been ruined by the retreating army, so the men intended simply to fill them with dirt and then begin grading the land for planting. With any luck, they would be ready to sow crops next spring. This spring was no longer an option. The soil was too torn, too raw, and the town would have to rely on food from other places for the coming months. It was another problem waiting for them, but one they could not solve today. Walking the length of the trench with Lucien, Claude inspected the work. They had been at it for 10 hours, and everyone was exhausted. "What's that?" Lucien asked, pointing past the trench towards a thin line of trees. Claude lifted his hand above his eyes in an effort to see better. He did not need to do this, but as everyone else did, it was instinct. "Just another pair of boots," Claude answered. "I'll go get them and bury them also. No need to leave them out in the open." Claude watched as Lucien made his way to the tree line. When there, Lucien froze in place. "Lucien, what's wrong? What is it?" Claude yelled. He could only watch as Lucien fell to his knees, removed his hat, and started to wail. Claude ran toward him, as did several others. They found Lucien hunched forward, one hand trembling as it hovered over the still form lying among the roots. It was a boy, a young one, 14 at most. His German uniform hung loosely on him, far too large for his narrow shoulders. His boots, too large for his feet. His hair, a pale brown, unkempt, fell across his forehead. Beside him lay a helmet that looked 2 sizes too large for his head. Claude understood immediately why Lucien had this reaction. The resemblance was unmistakable. Lucien's son Nicholas had died of the Spanish flu the year before, taken before he had even reached 15. Possibly the same age as this young German, the same slight frame, the same gentle features in the face now sunken in death. Lucien's body shook with grief. He reached forward with both hands, but stopped short of touching the boy, as if the weight of that simple gesture might shatter him entirely. Claude felt his breath leave him. This was different than the soldiers they had buried. This one was a child who could have been anyone's son. And for Lucien, he was. A voice nearby commented on how the harsh winter had preserved the body and how surprising it was that no animals had taken their liberty. Another mentioned the likeness to Nicholas, a fact Claude wished no one had spoken aloud. Lucien stood. His eyes were swollen from crying, and his dirty cheeks bore the pale streaks left by falling tears. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked away towards the setting sun, towards Saint Véron. When Lucien was out of earshot, Claude ordered everyone else to head home as well. They would do this all over again tomorrow. There was still plenty of debris to clear and land to level, if they could. Claude knocked on Lucien's shop door the next morning. He waited for what felt like hours, but in reality was only 30 seconds for Lucien to answer the door. "Good morning, Lucien. Will you be joining us in the fields today?" Lucien's eyes were lively, a contrast from how he had been the evening before. "No, I'm working on something. You go ahead." And that was all. He turned away and closed the door. By early August, the fields were ready, at least as ready as land could be after war had torn it apart. The soil would need the long winter to rest, to drink in the snows and the spring rains before it could bear crops again. They all understood that nothing would grow this year. Next spring, perhaps. Next fall, surely. St. Verone could not wait that long. The town needed to eat. To keep everyone fed, Claude found himself walking from village to village, traveling sometimes for hours along the river roads with baskets of fish packed in salt. Given their proximity to the Somme, St. Verone had always relied on fishing, and the river had been generous that summer. Their catch, often substantial, was what Claude used to barter with. In exchange for carp, pike, and eels, he returned with flour, potatoes, dried beans, and smoked meat, enough to stretch the town's food stores enough so that no child went to bed hungry. Food had become communal in those months. Every household shared what they had, unspoken but understood. No one questioned it, no one complained. They would survive the winter together or not at all. The work in the fields had tapered off as the days grew hotter. Most of the debris had been cleared. Trenches were filled and leveled. The jagged scars of the shell holes had been smoothed into wide depressions that would take time to settle. The dead had been buried with as much dignity as the situation allowed. Life in the town began, in small ways, to resemble itself again. Shops opened their doors. Children played near the river. Women hung laundry in the warm breeze. Even the church bells, long silent, rang once more. It was during one of those long summer days, after returning from a trade run to a village south of Corby, that Claude remembered he had not seen Lucien in nearly a month. The artisan had stopped coming to the fields after they had found the German boy that looked remarkably like Lucien's son, the distraught man slipping away in tears. Claude had meant to check on him sooner, but the needs of the town had pressed in, one after another, until the memory of Lucien's absence had simply drifted to the back of his mind. Now, walking back with a basket of dried sausages over one shoulder, he paused in the square. Lucien had been different since the early days of the work. Withdrawn, quiet, but many men were still quiet after the war. Clyde had thought it best not to pry. Still, a month was a long time. He shifted the basket, changed direction, and crossed the square towards the narrow lane that curved past the mill and led to Lucien's small workshop. The windows were closed, the shutters drawn, but thin chalky dust marked the sill like pale snow. Claude frowned. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. This time he heard movement inside. Slow footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being set aside. Then the latch clicked and the door opened just enough for Lucien to peer out. "Claude," Lucien said, as though speaking from far away. "I meant to come find you soon." "I thought I'd check on you," Claude replied. "The others have been asking. We haven't seen you in a while." "I've been working," Lucien said quietly. "Come in, I want to show you." He opened the door wide and stepped back. Claude entered, expecting perhaps furniture repairs, a carved beam, a cabinet, something practical, something ordinary. Instead, he saw a large shape shrouded under a linen cloth. Stone dust coated the floor in pale drifts. Tools lay neatly arranged on a bench. The whole workshop smelled of rock and sweat and long hours. Lucian crossed the room, took a hold of the cloth, and looked at Claude with a mixture of pride and something deeper, something vulnerable. "I finished it," he said, "or almost." He pulled the cloth away. Claude froze, looking at the statue before him. It was magnificent. Claude stepped closer to the statue, studying each detail in the stone. The boy at the center stood tall, carved in a doctor's coat, a stethoscope resting against his chest. At his left, another version of him balanced a football under one foot. To the right, yet another version carried a ledger as a young businessman might. Claude's first thought was Nicholas. The shape of the face, the lift of the chin, the way the boy's hair curled slightly at the forehead. It all pulled him back to Lucian's son, gone too soon from the fever that swept the valley the year before. "It's remarkable," Claude whispered. "I had forgotten how much your boy looked like this." Lucian stepped forward, his hands streaked with white stone dust. He shook his head gently. Claude furrowed his brow. "Then who?" "The boy," Lucian said softly. "What boy?" "The German boy that we found in the tree line." Claude froze. He had buried the memory of that moment as deeply as they had buried the child himself. Days of endless labor and exhaustion had pushed it away. "You carved him?" Claude said. "I carved what he could have been," Lucian answered. "What he could have been?" asked Charlie. "Yes, what he could have been had the war not come calling." "It's beautiful, Lucian. Absolutely stunning. Would you like to put it in the town square? We can build a pedestal." Lucian stepped back and looked at him. "No, I think this belongs up on the hill overlooking the graves." "On the hill? Why?" Lucian looked into his eyes. "Because every boy we buried there had a future that the war took away. That's why." Now it was Claude's turn to cry. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.